Hello, hello, hello. I am the Linux Mensch. So you better wish me happy anniversary. Well, next week. Next week is my anniversary. 5 years on Linux. And today I'm going to talk about my journey. So let's get to it. I purchased my first computer in 1991. And I never purchase brand new computers that are brand new on the market. I always purchase ones that are kind of starting to go off the market. So the brand new latest greatest computers on the market were coming with Windows 3.1. So I bought one of them that were starting to go off the market, and it just came with DOS and a simple utility for opening up your apps and that. It had no mouse. Everything was keyboard driven, kind of like Linux, right? Anyways, and I had a dot matrix printer. You know, the kind that has the paper feeder going into it and makes all that noise. And one day I was in the computer store and I saw a box of Windows 3.1. It was just over $100, so I purchased it, loaded it into the computer. It came with floppy disks. Loaded it into the computer, but it was running really, it worked, but it was running really sluggish, and some of my software wouldn't open up or run properly in it. So I took it out. Then I graduated to Windows 95, which of course I was able to use the mouse and learned how to use the mouse, and it was a lot friendlier to use. And I graduated to Windows 98. Then I graduated at work to Windows 2000 Professional. And at home, I bought a computer with Windows XP, and XP was pretty good. And I ended up using Windows XP at work for until after end of life, and there was no more security updates. And the reason why is that at work we had at this particular job, at this company, we had a soft piece of software that we were using that wouldn't work in Windows 7, but it would work in Windows XP. At the time, my bare metal computer at work was running Windows 7, and I had a virtual machine in there using VMware. There was a virtual machine of Windows XP, and that's where I was doing all my work in. So I could use that software that wouldn't work in Windows 7. And that was my first introduction to virtual machines. And like I said, I was running Windows XP in a virtual machine, but it was after end of life. So there was no security updates to it, but the bare metal computer had Windows 7 in it. And at home, I graduated from Windows XP to Windows Vista. I bought a computer with Windows Vista, and it was terrible. I really should get my money back for that. What a waste of money. Then I bought my first computer of Windows 7 for home in 2011. And in 2012, I wanted to buy a second computer for my home. So I went out, and at the time, Windows 8 had just come out. So in the store, they had computers with Windows 7 and computers with Windows 8. And I hated it. I took it home. I got it all set up. I hated Windows 8. So I took the computer back to the store and exchanged it for a computer with Windows 7. Then at home, I had two computers, both with Windows 7. One I purchased in 2011, and the other one I purchased in 2012. Now, fast forward up to March of 2019. And one of my computers at home was full and it wasn't functioning properly. Now, that computer had a 500 gig hard drive and it was full. And I couldn't understand it because my personal files, my personal videos, not YouTube videos, but just personal videos I had in there, music videos, music, all the music I purchased from iTunes, downloaded and stuff. My personal files were about 40 gigs. So I couldn't understand why my 500 gig hard drive computer was almost full and why it was running sluggish. And this was I think this was about March 2019. So I started watching technical videos in YouTube. And I watched some YouTube videos on how to set your computer back to factory. So the computer I was having trouble with, I set it back to factory. which I think it took about an hour or so, maybe 2 hours. But then this was 2019 and I was setting it back to 2011. So then I had to update it, and the updates took forever. So setting it back to factory and updating it took about 12 hours. And then getting all my music back into it and my videos back into it, and all my personal files back into it, and getting it set up the way I liked it, I think it was about a 12-hour trip. But then the computer was fixed. It was running a lot smoother. I was only using about 95 gig out of my half a terabyte hard drive, and everything was good. So you know what? I did it to the second computer too, even though I wasn't having trouble with the second computer. And the second computer had a terabyte hard drive, but I did it to that too, and that took another 12 hours. So both computers reset to factory. One I bought in 2011, the other one I bought in 2012. I set them back to factory and then updated them with my Windows operation to the current version of Windows 7. So that was a lot of work, but I found they were running a lot smoother and things were good. And that was around March and April 2019. Then in November 2019, Windows died. Well, I think it died in end of life of Windows 7 was October 2019. So then Windows allowed me to update my computers to Windows 10 for free. I didn't have to pay for it. I thought they were going to run slow, but I didn't know. So I watched some videos on how to update them to Windows 10. And I updated them to Windows 10, and that was actually easier and smoother than doing that factory reset 10 months before that and updating it in Windows 7 from 2011 and 2012 to 2019. So updating them to 2010 was a lot easier, and they worked okay. I thought they were going to be sluggish, but it wasn't too bad because my computers only had, each computer only had 4 gigabytes of RAM. So I didn't know if they were going to run properly in Windows 10, and they did. And I wasn't terribly impressed with Windows 10. I didn't like the icons twirling around in the start menu. It was too much for me. I ran Windows 10 in both my computers, my old computers, for a month or two. And then I stumbled onto this. I stumbled onto Chris Titus. And I started watching his videos on Linux Mint. And it looked kind of cool. Then I stumbled upon this video that Chris Titus did. Installing Linux is so easy, an 8-year-old can do it. And there's a picture of his daughter, his 8-year-old daughter, well, 5 years ago. And it's a 20-minute video, and I watched that. And in this video, she installed Linux Mint on a computer. Now, of course, he was standing behind her off camera, guiding her, but hey. And that, I thought to myself, if she can do it, I can do it. So I went to Linux Mint, downloaded their ISO, and installed it, following his video. And Linux Mint gave me the option to wipe out my hard drive and install it, or to install it as a dual boot next to Windows 10. So I did that. I chose that. I installed it as a dual boot to Windows 10. After installing it, I logged into Linux Mint. I played with it. I kind of liked it. And then I was able to log into my Windows 10. So I used it as a dual boot for about a week. And I decided I like it. I'm going to do a reinstall. And I'm going to wipe out my Windows 10. So I did a reinstall. And I put Linux Mint in. And I used it for a little bit. And then I thought, I wonder if I can get my Windows 10 back in. And I was able to do it. I was able to wipe out Linux Mint and get my Windows 10 back in. And of course, I had my Windows code from when I purchased the computer. It was on the box and a label. I was able to get Windows back in there. But then I thought, you know what? I don't like this Windows 10. It's too clunky, too bulky. So I deleted the Windows 10 again, and I put Linux Mint in, and I started using it full time. And this happened right at the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. 5 years. So I was using Linux Mint full time on one computer, and I liked it so much, I went to the other computer, and I deleted Windows 10, and I put Linux Mint in. And that was the computer that my wife was using. And sometimes I use it too. We were using that computer to live stream videos from the live streaming services that you pay for. And I had it hooked up to the stereo and the TV, and it was working in Linux Mint. And she was able to use it too. And so we had two computers, both running Linux Mint. Both computers only had 4 GB of RAM, and it was fantastic. I had everything I needed because Linux Mint comes with a full suite of software preloaded into the system. It comes with the full Office suite, the LibreOffice suite, music players, video players, utilities for formatting thumb drives. It's fantastic. And if it doesn't come preloaded with a software application that you need, you can go to their store. Well, I call it a store. It's not really a store. You can go to their software center and do a search for the software programs that you need and install them for free. So I was running Linux Mint on my computers for a few months. And then on the computer that I use, I started distro hopping. And my next stop was MX Linux. And I kind of liked it. And I used it for a week or two, but it was just too different for me. Now, it was running the XFCE desktop environment, but it was themed differently to the way they like it. And MX Linux is great. It comes with a lot of tools, and it's based on Debian. And it was okay. I was kind of impressed with it, but I ended up going back to Linux Mint. And on the computer out in the living room, the one my wife uses, that stayed on Linux Mint. I didn't distro hop with that one. Then I made my way to Manjaro. And Manjaro was my first experience of using an Arch-based Linux distribution. Now, I know a lot of people say that there's a debate going on. Is Manjaro really Arch Linux or not? And the reason why is that Manjaro pulls all their apps and software from the Arch Linux repositories, and they have their own repository. They hold everything back for 2 weeks for further testing, and then they release them. And when they release them, your updates and your downloads are coming directly from the Manjaro repositories and not from the Arch Linux ones. So there's a debate, is Manjaro really Arch Linux or not? Hey, but Manjaro was my first experience with an Arch-based distribution and with Pacman, and I really liked it. So with Manjaro, there's a choice of different desktop environments. So I used the Cinnamon desktop environment because I really liked it. Because the Cinnamon desktop environment was the one I was using in Linux Mint, and I really liked it. It's user-friendly. It has a weather app. It's very similar to an older version of Windows. And I think the Cinnamon desktop environment is the best one for a person migrating from Windows over to Linux. So like I said, Linux Mint team, they're the ones that created the Cinnamon desktop environment, and they're the ones that maintain it. So when I went to Manjaro, I used the Manjaro version with the Cinnamon desktop because it was my favorite. Well, it was the only desktop I was really familiar with besides Windows. So I really liked it. So I was using it in Manjaro. And during that time, I started watching other YouTubers, other Linux YouTubers, that is. I started watching Derek at Distro Tube, and he really turned me on to using the terminal. So I started using the terminal for more things, for doing updates, for downloading apps, for deleting apps. And I started using the terminal both in Manjaro and in the other computer where I was running Linux Mint. And he inspired me to do that. And I learned a lot from him. Then I started watching his videos about window managers. What is a window manager? And I watched some of his videos about window managers. I watched his videos about window managers. Then I discovered Steve at Tech Bloke, and he introduced me to the Mate desktop environment. So I played with Mate and installed Mate and then played with it. And then I started watching, because Mate desktop was Steve's, at one point, was his favorite desktop environment. But then he started to play with window managers. So I started watching his window manager videos and how he used to manipulate and change the configuration files. And I learned a lot from him, and his channel is great. Now, I just want to mention Steve at Tech Bloke. He passed away a year ago this past September. I think it was around the end of September 2023. So, Steve, thank you for all the work you did and for your videos, and may you rest in peace. That I was watching at the time was Switch to Linux, and I learned some things from him. I watched EF Linux, and I learned a lot of stuff from him on how to do installations, how to do things in the terminal, and so forth. Now, during this time, I tried to install Arch Linux, and back in those days, there was only one way to install Arch Linux, or pure Arch Linux, and that was the manual way, going into a terminal on the live ISO and typing in all the commands. And I tried several times and I wasn't able to do it. Couldn't figure it out. In order to use Arch Linux, I had to use Manjaro, which was based on Arch Linux. Then I discovered Anarchy Installer. Now, Anarchy Linux was really not a distribution that was based on Arch Linux, and they told you so on their website. What they were was a third-party installer that gave you a graphical installer for installing pure Arch Linux. Now, the only thing is they gave you some wallpapers, and they gave me a Zesh configuration file, and it's their Zesh configuration file that I use that's in my repository, but I manipulated it and changed it to the way I like it, and I put all my aliases in there. But like I said, they're not a distribution based on Arch Linux, and they told you so. They were a third-party installer. So I used them to install Arch Linux on 2 computers, and that was my first introduction to using pure Arch Linux. Because at the time, like I said, Arch Linux, the Arch install, or the automated Arch Linux installer that's available now on the ISO wasn't available. So the only way to install pure Arch Linux was to do it the manual way in the terminal. But Anarchy Linux gave me the ability to do that. Now, don't use the Anarchy installer now because it reached end of life in 2022. And I think part of the reason, I don't really know, I'm just guessing, but I think part of the reason why it reached end of life is because Arch Linux now comes with its own automated installer called Arch Install. And I think I read somewhere a while back that the Anarchy installer came to end of life because it's really, if you're an installer or a third-party installer for Arch Linux, it's really hard to keep up with Arch Linux because it's a rolling release and it's moving so fast. So I don't suggest you use it because it's reached its end of life in 2022. But that was my first introduction to actually installing and using pure Arch Linux. And by this time, I was watching Mental Outlaw's channel. And I found this video from him right here. Arch Linux Installation Guide, best on YouTube. And this was 4 years old. It's probably almost 5 years old. And I watched that video, and that video got me over the hump. And I was able to install Arch Linux, pure Arch Linux, the manual way, by typing in all the commands in the terminal. And now that I have my own YouTube channel, I have quite a few videos where I show how to install Arch Linux the manual way, and my method is based on his method with a few tweaks. By this time I was running Arch Linux, pure Arch Linux that is, on 2 computers. So my 2 computers were running on 4 gigs of RAM each for 7 months on Linux, and they were running fine. But I decided it was time to get more RAM. So I upgraded my computers to 8 gigs of RAM each. And I found I had lots of RAM and they were running fantastic. And I was running 2 computers on pure Arch Linux installed the manual way. How about that, eh? Sorry. Anyways, but I was still doing some distro hopping, and I tried some different Linux distributions. I'm not going to mention them now. Some of them were based on Ubuntu and Debian. But I really liked Arch Linux. I liked Linux Mint. I liked Manjaro, and I liked pure Arch Linux. And like I said, I did quite a bit of distro hopping. And at this point, I wasn't using virtual machines, downloading an ISO, erasing my computer, and the distribution I wanted to test out, I was installing it on my hard drive, playing with it, If I liked it, I used it for a while. If I didn't like it, I took it out right away. And I always ended up going back either to Linux Mint, Manjaro, or pure Arch Linux. So I noticed in the videos, most of the people I was watching were testing out Linux distributions and virtual machines, and they were using VirtualBox. So I downloaded VirtualBox and installed it, and I started using it to test out different Linux distributions I was interested in. And it was working pretty good. It was pretty easy to use. It was easy to download and install, and it was easy to use. It was user-friendly. And then I noticed one day, Derek at Distro Tube switched from VirtualBox to Virt-Manager. And he started using, and I kept thinking, what is this Virt-Manager? What is that? And Virt-Manager is a front end to QEMU, and the Linux kernel has built into it the ability to do virtualization. And it runs on QEMU, and you can use it from the terminal, but Virt-Manager is an user-friendly, easy-to-use front end to QEMU. And I watched this video here, this one right here. Goodbye VirtualBox, hello Virt-Manager. I watched that, and he also has a few more videos on Virt-Manager. Here's another one, Virt-Manager tips and tricks, and I watched that. So I downloaded Virt-Manager and installed it, and that was a little harder to download and install and to get it up and running. It's not as easy as Virt-Manager, but once it's up and running, it's really easy to use, and I found my virtual machines opened a lot faster and ran faster. So I started using Virt-Manager. And then I ended up buying another used computer that had 16 gigabytes of RAM. So in the virtual machines, I started playing with doing my distro hopping in the virtual machines rather than erasing my hard drive on my bare metal computer and installing just distributions in there. And I also started playing with a lot of window managers, and I got to use window managers. And my first window manager that I started using was the awesome window manager, which I'm using right now. So right now, this is my bare metal computer. It's running Arch Linux with the awesome window manager. So I started using window managers, and I used awesome. I learned how to manipulate the configuration file, how to work in the config file, and how to change the config file to the way I like it. And then the second window manager I used was Qtile. And I learned how to manipulate that configuration file and to set it up to the way I like it. And this is Qtile. Now this is a virtual machine of Arch Linux with the Qtile window manager. And I also played with the i3 window manager and manipulated it to make my own configuration file to change it to the way I like it. And I also installed DWM and learned how to configure it and play with DWM window manager. Now, I do have DWM is installed on my main production computer, but I can't log out of it and log into it to show you because I'm recording and my recording is going to turn off. And in this particular virtual machine, I don't have DWM installed. And for the first 3 or 4 years of running Linux, I hated the Gnome desktop environment. In the past year, I learned to love the Gnome desktop environment. And the reason why I like Gnome, for several reasons. Number one, it just works. Number two, Gnome desktop environment makes it really simple and easy to do remote desktop. So the computer in the other room, the one that my wife uses most of the time, but we also use it because it's connected to the stereo and the TV for live streaming, TV shows and movies. Right now, it's running Gnome, and it's been running Gnome for maybe at least 6 months, perhaps since the spring. And it's running Gnome, and from here, I can do a remote desktop into it, and it's just like I'm sitting in front of the computer as far as my keyboard and my mouse and using all the GUI applications, using everything I need to use. It's fantastic. And the Gnome desktop environment makes it user-friendly. It makes it super easy to do remote desktop. So in the past year, during this year of 2024, I did quite a few videos on the Gnome desktop environment and learned to really love it. So the computer out in the living room, it's running the Gnome desktop environment. And also, my wife is not a window manager person, So before Gnome, it was running Cinnamon. That computer out there, since I've been on Linux, it's been running the Cinnamon desktop environment. But since the spring, it's been running Gnome. And I should have showed you this before. This is Virt-Manager. I have all these virtual machines. I have a Windows 10 virtual machine. You can see here I have a Windows 11 virtual machine, but it's not working. I tried to install Windows 11 a week or so ago, and I couldn't get it up and running. Now, I used to have a Windows 11 virtual machine in here that was working, but I deleted it because every once in a while I'll delete my virtual machines because I just want to clean up my hard drive. But this Windows 10 virtual machine is running. And while we're here, I'll just mention, so the only thing I miss in Linux is iTunes. In Linux, you can't use iTunes. It doesn't work. They don't make a version for Linux. And you can try to install iTunes in Wine. Wine is an application that you can install in Linux. And I think it stands for Wine is not an emulator. And an emulator is just a virtual machine. And Wine, like I said, Wine is a program you can install on Linux, and it allows you to run some Windows programs inside your Linux, but iTunes doesn't work properly with it. So the best way to use iTunes is to use it in a Windows computer. So when I want to use iTunes, I just fire up my virtual machine of Windows 10 and I use iTunes. And the reason why is that I have iPods, not the iPad. Well, I have those too. But my iPods for music, when I plug them into Linux programs, they get messed up. The files get messed up and everything. So I find for me, it's best to plug my iPods into iTunes. And that's the only reason why I have this Windows 10 here. And of course, I have all these other virtual machines. Okay, and right now I'm running Arch Linux number 4, which is this one. Okay, so that is the virtual machines. That's Virt-Manager. Now, this is a virtual machine of Arch Linux with the Cinnamon desktop. And it has the weather app, has everything you need. For internet, I have Firefox, Ramina for desktop remote, or I have the Tor browser for secretly surfing the web and hiding your IP address. And I have Celluloid, which is a program for watching videos. ClipGrab is a program for grabbing and downloading videos from the internet so that they're in your hard drive and you end up owning them. Kdenlive is for editing videos. MPV is also for watching videos. OBS Studio is for recording videos. Rhythmbox is for music. Rhythmbox is a great music player. And of course, there's a lot of other music players in Linux. And there's all kinds of other programs. You can have everything you want or need in Linux. Now, apparently gaming used to be really bad in Linux years ago. And apparently it's really good now. Now, I'm not a gamer. I've never gamed. I've never even played one game. So I can't speak. I can only say what I've heard other Linux YouTubers talking about. And a lot of them are saying that gaming is pretty good now in Linux. That's all I'm going to say about gaming because I really don't know anything about it. So now I'm back in my bare metal computer, and this is OBS Studio. I use this for recording my videos. And if I go here, I can open up Kdenlive. I use Kdenlive to edit my videos. And I can open up Gimp. I use Gimp for my thumbnails. Now, the only thing is that for my thumbnails, and as you probably already noticed if you're following my channel, my thumbnails usually include me making a face, either a smile or a funny face, with a note on the thumbnail saying this is what the video is about. And my thumbnails, I used to make the whole thing in Gimp. Well, I used to take a picture with my iPad, put it into Gimp, and then I scrub out the background and put my note in there, or a few words in there about what the video is about. And I found scrubbing out the background was easy, but getting around the edges of my face and my hair and my collar, that was hard. And if I was standing like this, getting in between here, that was a bit tricky. So now what I do is take a picture with my iPad, and I use the iPad to get the background out, which takes like a second. And then I put the picture of myself, the background already taken out from my iPad. Then I put it into Gimp, And then I changed the background color and I put a note in there saying what the video is about. So I still use Gimp to make my thumbnails. I just use the iPad to take my picture and to easily and quickly get the background out. Otherwise, everything else about the making of my videos is made with Linux. And while we're talking about the making of videos, 2 years ago, this past October, towards the middle of October, 2 years ago, I started my YouTube channel. And I didn't know if I was going to stick with it. It was sort of like an experiment. Can I do this? So I only spent $50 on a camera and $50 on a microphone. And I started making YouTube videos, and it's been a blast. And I want to thank all the people who've been watching my videos and following my channel, giving me comments, contributing, giving me thumbs up. That's it. In this video, I went back in time to 1991 when I purchased my first computer, and I walked you through all the different Windows operating systems I used and why and how I switched to Linux. And I showed you the different Linux YouTubers that I watched, the main ones, and I talked about the different Linux distributions I used and how I switched from desktop environment to window managers, and how I switched from distro hopping on my bare metal computer to using virtual machines, and how I switched from VirtualBox to Virt-Manager, and how during this year I ended up liking Gnome desktop environment. And I also talked about the different apps I use, and the only app I miss is iTunes. And I talked about all the different apps that are available in Linux. And I ended up talking about my YouTube channel, which I started just over 2 years ago. So I've been on Linux for 5 years in my home. I still use Windows at work, unfortunately. But in my home, all my computers are running Linux, and there's no turning back. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like it and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I am the Linux Mensch.